Michael Mortensen was used to adrenaline. As a firefighter in Wichita, he had faced blazing infernos and situations most people would only see in movies. But nothing had prepared him for what he experienced on that fishing trip in the Adirondacks of New York State. The trip was supposed to be a break from the grind, a few days with his buddies in the crisp autumn air. The foliage was at its peak, the trees ablaze with shades of orange and red. The Adirondacks were nothing like Wichita's flat plains. Here, the world rose and fell in waves of rugged terrain, dense forests, and glittering lakes. Michael had always loved movies, especially thrillers and horror films. The trip reminded him of countless scenes he'd watched where characters ventured into the wilderness and faced things they couldn't explain. He'd even seen a documentary about Bigfoot once, the infamous cryptid rumored to roam the forests of North America. He and his friends had joked about it on the drive up, but the laughter had felt hollow against the vastness of the woods. Their cabin was modest, perched near a secluded lake, the kind of place where cell reception was a rumor. They spent the first day fishing, the calm water reflecting the fiery leaves and the sky, a soft gray that promised rain but never delivered. The air was cool, a slight breeze carrying the earthy scent of the forest. It was on the second day that things began to feel off. Michael noticed it first, the way the birds suddenly went silent around midday. The usual hum of the forest seemed muted, as though it were holding its breath. "You hear that?" Michael asked as they prepared their lines on the shore. "Hear what?" Tim, one of his friends, replied, not looking up. "Exactly," Michael said. "Nothing." Tim shrugged. "Just a quiet day. Relax, man." But Michael couldn't shake the unease. That night, as they sat around the campfire, the feeling grew. They roasted hot dogs on sticks and shared beers, the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces. The forest pressed in around them, dark and endless. Then, just beyond the firelight, Michael thought he saw movement, a shadow shifting between the trees. "You see that?" he asked, his voice low. "What now?" Tim groaned. "I swear, something's out there." The group turned to look, but the shadows were still. Jake, another friend, laughed. "You've been watching too many of those movies, man. Bigfoot's not real." But Michael wasn't so sure. He remembered stories he'd heard, campfire tales and strange accounts from hunters. Bigfoot, the elusive creature said to roam the wilderness, was often described as a massive, hairy being, almost human, but not quite. There were tales of it watching from the shadows, leaving enormous footprints in the mud, and even letting out bone-chilling screams that echoed through the trees. That night, Michael lay awake in his sleeping bag, listening. The cabin's walls felt thin against the vastness of the woods. He thought of his sister back in Wichita, how they used to watch horror movies together when they were kids. She'd always laugh at the scary parts, saying, "You know it's fake, right?" Michael wished he could believe that now. The next morning, they found tracks. They were massive, larger than any bears, with toes that looked disturbingly human. The group stared in silence, their breath visible in the cool morning air. "Bear," Jake said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "No bear makes tracks like that," Michael said. The day passed in uneasy quiet. They fished, but the joy was gone, replaced by a constant feeling of being watched. Michael kept glancing over his shoulder, catching glimpses of movement he couldn't quite pin down. By evening, the tension was unbearable. As they sat around the fire, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Then, from the shadows came a low growl. "What the hell was that?" Tim whispered, his face pale in the firelight. Michael stood, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam landed on a figure, a hulking shape partially concealed behind a tree. It was massive, its outline unmistakably humanoid but covered in thick, dark fur. Its eyes caught the light, glowing faintly. "Run," Michael said, his voice barely audible. They bolted for the cabin, the fire still burning behind them. Inside, they barricaded the door and windows, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The creature prowled outside, its heavy footsteps circling the cabin. Occasionally, they'd hear it tap or scrape against the walls, testing their defenses. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Not yet," Michael said. "We wait until it's gone." Hours passed. The creature's sounds faded, but none of them dared to leave the cabin. When dawn broke, the forest was eerily quiet again. "This is our chance," Michael said. They grabbed what they could and made a dash for their car. The walk back to the dirt road where they'd parked felt endless, every rustling leaf sending their hearts racing. The tracks they'd seen before were everywhere now, crisscrossing the trail. Then, just as they reached the car, the creature appeared again, standing at the edge of the woods. In the daylight, it was even more terrifying. Its sheer size and presence almost supernatural. It didn't move, just watched as they scrambled into the vehicle and sped away. None of them spoke until they reached the nearest town. Even then, the words felt inadequate. Whatever they'd seen, it wasn't something they wanted to explain, or could explain. Michael returned to Wichita with a newfound appreciation for the safety of concrete and steel. But he couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes watching from the woods, a reminder that some things are better left unknown. The road trip was supposed to be a chance for Sylvester Stallone and his friends to unwind. It was early October, and the colors of Michigan's forests were in full display, leaves crunching underfoot and the wind carrying the crisp bite of impending winter. They had decided to make a stop near a small town on the Upper Peninsula, a place known for its rustic charm and dense woods. Sylvester, a firefighter from Seattle, was always up for an adventure. His dog Max, a German Shepherd mix with an unflinching loyalty, sat in the backseat of the car, his head occasionally poking out to catch the scents on the wind. The group, 4 friends in total, was eager to explore the local trails and maybe build a fire to keep warm as the sun went down. Sylvester had always been a gym enthusiast, the kind of guy who could deadlift a car if the situation called for it, but even he was awed by the vastness of the forest here. It was a far cry from Seattle's bustling streets and rainy skies. That evening, they pulled off onto an old logging road, parking at a makeshift campsite deep in the woods. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves like whispers in a forgotten language. They set up their fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. Sylvester had brought up a movie he'd once seen about the Rougarou, a creature of Native American folklore, said to be cursed, part man, part beast, with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. "Think we'll run into one out here?" joked Kyle, the group's self-appointed skeptic. "Not unless it's bulking season," Sylvester replied with a grin, patting his bicep. But the laughter died down quickly when Max started growling, his ears pinned back, his body rigid. "What's up with him?" asked Taylor, her voice tinged with unease. Sylvester looked into the shadows just beyond the firelight. "He's never like this." "Max is steady." Then came the noise, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo all around them. The group froze. "What the hell was that?" whispered Hannah, her marshmallow slipping off the stick and into the fire. The growl came again, closer this time. Sylvester shone his flashlight toward the source, and the beam caught the glint of eyes. They were high off the ground, too high to belong to any ordinary animal, and the silhouette that emerged from the trees was massive. "It can't be." Sylvester muttered, his mind racing back to the stories of the Rougarou. The creature was described as humanoid, with elongated limbs, sharp claws, and an insidious hunger that drove it to stalk its prey relentlessly. The thing moved closer, stepping into the edge of the firelight. Its face was distorted, somewhere between human and wolf, its teeth bared in a snarl. Max barked furiously, straining against Sylvester's grip on his collar. "Everyone, back to the car!" Sylvester shouted. But before they could act, the creature lunged. Max broke free, leaping at the beast, giving the others just enough time to grab what they could and run. Sylvester's heart twisted as he heard Max yelp, a sound that cut through the chaos like a blade. They ran blindly through the forest, the wind whipping against their faces. The creature's growls echoed behind them, but its footsteps were eerily quiet, as though it floated just above the ground. "Keep moving!" Sylvester urged, his firefighter training kicking in. He led the group off the trail, ducking under low-hanging branches and weaving through the trees. The creature's sounds grew fainter, but they knew it wasn't gone. They found a hollow beneath a massive fallen tree and crawled inside, pressing themselves against the damp earth. The wind howled through the forest, masking the sounds of the creature's movements. They sat in silence, their breaths shallow, listening for any sign of pursuit. Sylvester's thoughts raced. He remembered his father, a man of few words but unshakable courage, teaching him the importance of staying calm under pressure. "Fear doesn't help," his father used to say. "It just gets in the way." But even his father hadn't faced anything like this. After what felt like hours, Sylvester decided it was time to move. "Stay quiet. Follow me," he whispered. They crept through the forest, using the wind to mask their movements. The creature was still out there. They could feel its presence like a shadow at their backs. At one point, they stumbled upon a torn piece of Max's collar, and Sylvester had to bite down hard to stifle his grief. Finally, they reached the main road. The headlights of an approaching truck were like a beacon of hope. They waved frantically, and the driver, an older man with a weathered face, pulled over. "What's wrong?" he asked, his eyes widening as he saw their state. "Just drive," Sylvester said, his voice hoarse. As the truck sped away, Sylvester looked back at the forest. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the creature standing at the tree line, its glowing eyes watching them leave. The group made it to the nearest town, shaken but alive. Sylvester never found Max, a loss that weighed on him heavily. The others tried to convince him to talk to the police, but he knew they wouldn't believe him. In the weeks that followed, Sylvester couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And every time the wind howled through the trees, he swore he could hear that guttural growl, a reminder that some stories aren't just stories. It was one of those bright winter days when the sun seemed more for show than warmth, casting a stark light over Montana's snow-draped landscapes. I had never been to this part of the country before, and its vastness felt different than Chicago. Back home, the streets were hemmed in by skyscrapers, the skyline cutting into the horizon. Out here, the horizon was endless, stretching into white plains and dark silhouettes of pines, their tops dusted with snow. The chill in the air wasn't softened by the sunshine. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The trip wasn't my idea. My friend Eric, the kind of guy who never stopped talking about the untouched wilderness, had insisted we go for a road trip to reconnect with nature. Melissa and Jamie had tagged along too, for reasons I couldn't fathom. None of us were outdoorsy, but Eric's enthusiasm had a way of dragging people along. We'd spent the morning driving through narrow back roads, the car tires crunching on patches of ice and gravel. Around noon, Eric suggested we stop in a wooded area off the highway to stretch our legs. "You're gonna love it," he said. Quiet, peaceful, no honking horns or smog. The trees were tall, their branches heavy with snow. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced as the wind whispered through the forest. We built a small fire near the edge of a clearing to stave off the biting cold. The flames crackled, sending thin spirals of smoke into the air. I kept myself busy checking the car, making sure it was ready for the drive back. Cars were my thing. I spent most of my free time back in Chicago fixing up old models in my garage. There was something comforting about the straightforwardness of an engine, the way every piece fit together with a purpose. It was a simplicity you didn't find often in people. While I worked, I caught snippets of the others' conversation. They were talking about the wildlife out here, bears, elk, wolves. I wasn't too worried. We had a couple of knives, and Eric had brought a flare gun just in case. The first sign that something was wrong came from Jamie, who had wandered a bit farther into the trees. "Guys," she called, her voice uncertain, "come here, you have to see this." We walked over, our boots crunching in the snow. Jamie was standing near a large tree, pointing at the ground. There in the snow were tracks. They were huge. They were huge, larger than any wolf or bear I'd ever heard of. The shape was wrong, too, more like an elongated hand with claw marks digging deep into the frost. "What the hell?" Melissa muttered, glancing nervously at the woods around us. Eric crouched down, his face lit with curiosity. It's probably just some animal, maybe a deformity or something. But even he didn't sound convinced. The forest seemed quieter now. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of wildlife, birds chirping, branches creaking, were absent. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath. Then I saw it. Sitting behind a tree just far enough that the shadows obscured most of its form was something. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it shifted slightly, and I saw its eyes. They gleamed in the sunlight, unnervingly human, but set in a face that was anything but. Its body was massive, covered in dark fur that blended with the tree bark. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, staring at us. Eric? I said, my voice low. You seeing this? Eric turned, and his face went pale. What is that? Melissa whispered. No one answered. For a moment, we all just stood there, frozen. Then the thing rose. It didn't stand so much as unfold itself, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements eerily fluid. Jamie screamed, and that was all it took. The creature lunged, and we ran. I heard the sound of its pursuit, the crunch of snow, the snapping of branches. It was fast, too fast for something its size. We bolted through the forest, dodging trees and stumbling over roots hidden beneath the snow. Jamie was ahead of me, but Melissa tripped and fell, her scream piercing the air. I stopped, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. Keep going, I shouted. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned, giving way to a small village. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sight of it was like a lifeline. We staggered into the nearest building, a general store. The man behind the counter looked up, startled by our appearance. Something's in the woods, I gasped, my breath fogging in the cold air. We didn't call the police. What could we say? That a monster was chasing us? But we stayed in that village until a truck heading back toward the highway gave us a ride. I don't know what we saw that day. None of us talked about it on the drive home. But every so often I think back to those eyes glinting in the shadows, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting.